Hello and welcome to the Americano podcast. My name is Freddie Gray. I'm the deputy editor of The Spectator and the editor of its US edition. We thought that 2020 was going to be all about the presidential election, but now it will forever be the year of the pandemic. So instead, Americano is going to look at how COVID-19 is transforming the United States and its politics. There's a lot to talk about, perhaps even more so than before. So please keep tuning in. I'm joined today by Andy No, who is editor-at-large for the Post-Millennial, and we're going to be talking about the riots that have broken out in Minneapolis and now in Los Angeles. Andy, take us through what's happened with these riots. We know that they are in response, or they were triggered, perhaps, by the mass circulation of a video of a 46-year-old black man being sort of his neck was being kneeled on to the point that he appears to have suffocated and died from that. And this has caused a huge backlash on social media, and now it has erupted into violence on the streets. What's going on?
It's not just a backlash. I would describe it as a national crisis for this country. So you're describing the death of Mr. George Floyd, who died on the 25th of May, and part of his encounter, final moments with Minneapolis police were caught on camera in very disturbing footage. 4 policemen who were involved in that arrest have been sacked, and there's an ongoing investigation by federal authorities into civil rights violations. But I want to sort of step back a little bit because everybody's focused on Mr. Floyd. We've had sort of incident after incident this month in the United States that have really primed the American public for a backlash, anger, and now violent rioting. I would call it race riots, actually. So earlier this month, we had the incident of there was a young man named Sean Reed in Indianapolis who live streamed his fleeing from police in a high-speed chase encounter. He was actually armed with a gun that you could see in his video, and according to police, he shot back, and he was killed in that process. That same time frame that happened was the release of the video of Ahmaud Arbery in Georgia. Now, he was killed in February, but that video came out at the beginning of this month. So both of these just really put on the minds of the American conscience again Black Lives Matter, which had kind of sizzled down since reaching sort of its apex in 2015 when we had very violent riots across the US, as well as 2 instances of mass murders of law enforcement officers. So that's the background. And last night, it spilled over until riots in Minneapolis in response to the death of George Floyd, where you didn't just have the looting of businesses, you had Antifa working together with Black Lives Matter extremists who did looting as well as the destruction of property through arson attacks. So you have an entire block in an area of Minneapolis where the buildings have been razed to the ground. Target, which is a kind of supermarket store, was completely ransacked and looted. Auto parts store was set on fire. I think probably the saddest thing is one of the buildings that was targeted in an arson attack was a affordable housing building that was under construction. There's nothing left. And as of this morning, the fumes are still ongoing.
And how much do we know about, I mean, you've had a lot of experience with Antifa, I know, and we should talk about that too, but how much do we know that how do Antifa get involved in these riots? How does the process work? Do they presumably they're looking for opportunities to cause trouble and incite violence? How do they get involved how do they embroil themselves in these situations?
So American Antifa, typically how they organize is they latch themselves onto some other event and they use it as an opportunity to turn tense but peaceful protests into riots. That's what happened in Portland and other cities. So on university campuses, for example, like at UC Berkeley, there would be left-wing protests organized, let's say, against Milo or Ben Shapiro, but then there would be outside agitators who come in, who take it a step further. What we saw last night was, I think the looting would have happened if Antifa wasn't there anyways, but what the extra element they added to it was the arson attacks. And the coordination that they had in those attacks, these aren't amateurs. I was able to detect the Antifa element because many of the people who were recorded committing some of the violent rioting last night were dressed in militant Antifa black bloc uniforms, which is not really characteristic for some of these BLM type looters. And then I was looking at what Antifa accounts online were saying on social media. And of course, they started a jail fund for any of the comrades that may be arrested now in the near future. And then I looked at the graffiti that's being sprayed around in Minneapolis and Los Angeles as well. So the dog whistles to people who have anarchist, communist, extremist ideology.
Yeah. And what is their sort of stated purpose? I mean, Antifa is anti-fascist, I realise that, but has it evolved into something else now?
So Antifa is a movement of extreme anarchist communists who want revolution. How they differ from sort of classic revolutionary communists is that they believe that they can create a utopia without the need for a authoritarian communist state. So it's a utopian ideal, and the anarchy and violence helps them achieve their goals in that it's destabilizing for society. It works to undermine trust in the rule of law enforcement. So a particular unique manifestation of Antifa in the US is how it's really merged on elements of intersectionality and Black identity / Black nationalism, which is why they've really allied themselves with Black Lives Matter, because Black Lives Matter at its core it's a Marxist anti-police movement and an ideology, and Antifa see an opportunity to pair up with the mainstream movement that works to delegitimize law enforcement institutions in the US, and they've had massive success.
Do you think these riots are at all connected to the lockdown? It feels to me like there might be a little bit of sort of public anger at the lockdown that's being vented here in these protests.
That's an astute observation. I think you're right. Americans now seem really glued onto their social media. And so you're having, I'm sure you as well as the listeners here are aware of that incident of the woman in New York City with the dog and how that became a national incident when it was really a non-eventful, unpleasant encounter between two people. But America has just been on edge because of this lockdown, but then we've also had these other incidents that I told you from this month that have sort of really centered at the forefront of the conscience race relations. So every single incident now is a spark for something larger, and we're seeing it escalate more and more and more.
It's boiling over now, you think?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
To the benefit of radical and fringe ideological movements in the US.
And that, because I mean, we've seen this pattern before coronavirus. We saw this pattern happen before. You have a black person is killed in what looks like, or sometimes often is, a disgusting way by the police. You have a kind of outrage on social media, and that then spills into violence or looting on the streets. It seems to fit a pattern that happens again and again, but perhaps this time do the riots seem more serious than they have been for some years?
Yes, well, America has had nearly 4 years of reprieve from some of the peak of the riots in 2014 through 2016. I think some people are caught off guard in that they didn't think that a BLM mass riot could break out again. But if you just sort of map out the influencer networks who work to spread agitprop, is what I would call it, and false narratives. So, for example, the former police officer, Derek Chauvin, the one who is seen putting his knee on the neck of Mr. Floyd. There was this viral post going on Twitter yesterday from many Twitter verified people of his picture juxtaposed with a person allegedly wearing a hat that said "Make whites great again." Now, the person in that hat is not the officer, but a lot of people believed it to be. So there are agitators on social media who have undue, unchecked influence and ability to reach masses of people with disinformation, misinformation, with the purpose of spreading hatred of police, and I would say trying to accelerate towards like a race war.
And they seem to be getting what they want at the moment because, as I understand, the vigilante groups are now forming to protect businesses. Armed vigilante groups are forming to protect businesses, which on the one hand is understandable, but on the other hand may well lead to, quite serious escalations in violence.
Yes, it needs to be mentioned that the rioting that happened last night did result in the death of one alleged looter. According to reports on the ground, a man who was looting a pawn shop was shot dead by the store owner. And I think as people who are seeing the clips that are coming out from last night and this morning on social media, one thing that's really shocking is that you just don't see any police responding or any firefighters responding to these huge flames that have engulfed an entire block in Minneapolis. And what had happened earlier in the night during the rioting is when police did respond to the incident at the auto parts store that was looted and set on fire, militant rioters threw rocks and projectiles at responding firefighters. And then after that, they just let the city burn.
And I mean, it's happening. This is happening in an election year. And in 2016, the Trump campaign, I think, made quite a lot of political capital out of Black Lives Matter. It was certainly law and order was a big theme of his convention speech. Do you think this will become a major issue for Trump and Biden moving into November?
Well, I mean, both Democrats and Republicans are really, really trying to chip out the black vote in any way they can. And the Trump campaign in the past few years has really been focused on prison reform and justice reform. And so it seems it would be a shift in his message now if he was to go more towards a staunch law and order type of leader. The people that he's had around him, the messaging that they had in the campaign has really been about, it actually is similar to what the Democrats say, wanting less punitive sentencing, fewer charges, etc.
Well, and then let's move on to your story, because quite a lot of our British listeners may not have heard about what happened to you in Antifa. Can you tell us a little bit about what happened to you last year and maybe, how your life has changed?
Yes, on the 29th of June 2019, I was documenting on my GoPro and my mobile phone a protest in downtown Portland that was organized by socialist groups as well as Antifa groups. And they have been critical of my work for more than a year at that point. I've been published in a number of places such as Spectator USA, I've written for Wall Street Journal, and my columns and essays have highlighted the violent extremism that is allowed to become routine in Portland. And because of that, because they don't like my work, what had happened is I was targeted in a beating that was partially caught on camera. It became a big viral scene because there were some journalists who captured part of that beating, and I was sent to the hospital with a very severe brain injury, traumatic brain injury, of which I'm still having treatment for. So I've come face to face with radical left-wing violent extremists, and it seems like in America in the past 5 years there's really kind of been this resurgence of left-wing extremism that's been ignored and downplayed by the mainstream media because of incidents like Charlottesville and the alt-right. All the oxygen out of the room has been focused on far-right extremism while neglecting America's long history going back to the 60s and 70s of left-wing terrorists.
Well, and I mean, there are moves, are there not, to designate Antifa a terrorist group? I think there's a resolution in Congress at the moment. Do you know about that?
Yes, so these moves it's sort of political grandstanding. The US, unlike the UK, doesn't have the ability to proscribe organizations based on ideology because of how robust and strong our First Amendment is, which is why you're able to see there are all these extreme groups like the KKK and various and violent neo-Nazi groups who are not outlawed in the US. It's the activities they do and plan that are outlawed, but not actual organizing existing. So that's one of the struggles and weaknesses of living in a liberal democracy that really protects free speech, is that it also protects extremist speech. And so those moves are just sort of political gestures, in my opinion. It really would not have the ability to have any type of enforcement.
Could they not? I mean, I'm not suggesting this is a good idea, but could they not, if they were to be, described as a domestic terrorist group, or a terrorist group similar to Al-Qaeda, say, could they not be investigated using emergency powers?
So if it's declared as a terrorist group, I think if the Trump administration were to do that, it would be immediately politicized and delegitimized by the left. You saw them actually defending Antifa after my beating. Many people tried to find ways to justify their actions because this movement describes itself as anti-fascist. But I do support sort of a formal government declaration, even if it has no legal teeth to it, just because I think it would be helpful for journalists to be able to, whenever they reference an Antifa movement, to also include a US designated violent extremist ideology or something. Similar to how the Southern Poverty Law Center has been used to describe right-wing extremist groups by journalists. They'll always cite the SPLC, whereas there's really no sort of counter to be able to cite some type of organization or government entity for left-wing extremist groups.
And language is really the issue here in a way, isn't it? Because, I mean, you see it a lot in the media. I've seen it today that these obvious rioters are being called protesters. And there's a sort of acceptance that this is, in a way, that this is a sort of understandable reaction to police violence. Sort of unfortunate but understandable reaction to police violence. And you hear a lot of people in the media talk like that. And it's like large sections of the commentariat are effectively endorsing political violence.
Absolutely. The victory of Antifa is not that they will achieve any type of revolution. I think it's that they've been able to really capture really powerful cultural institutions such as the media, in that when you have acts of such wicked criminality, I mean, we're in the middle of a pandemic right now. Millions of people have lost their jobs. This is a really devastating time for Americans to see businesses and properties and future homes destroyed for no reason, really. These people said they're thinking that they're doing it out of a sense of justice, but they get a certain amount of legitimacy and protection from the media, who go out of the way to always try to describe it as peaceful. They did that in 2014, 2015, when many of these BLM protests, the people were chanting, calling for police to be killed. I think my concern is not just with the one-off or the riots that may last for a few days. My concern is that there's been a really obvious chipping away in the trust of legal institutions in the U.S., the rule of law. I mean, one thing that was fascinating about last night was seeing a mob, literally a lynch mob, show up at the former police officer's home. They organized because some of them wanted to kill him. But there were dozens and dozens of police standing guard around the property. And if they weren't there, that man would have been killed or his home would have been set on fire. And, to see this in 2020 in a major American city, there are various troubling currents in American society that need to be addressed.
Is one of them that does it because of the rhetoric around Trump? Because, I mean, if you believe, as a lot of people in the media will happily say, that Trump is a Nazi or a white supremacist, and if you genuinely believe that the president of the United States is a white supremacist, then acting violently against that authority, or what you perceive to be authority, is not necessarily an unreasonable act.
That's right. The most dangerous people in history are those who think that what they're doing is for good. So in the whole Antifa and BLM ideology, they feel that they believe truly that they are fighting back against fascism and white supremacy, and therefore any act, no matter how extreme or violent, is justified. So, you look at some of these videos, such as people attacking a woman in a wheelchair, they're justifying that because she was trying to stop some of the looting, and they're viewing her as upholding the status quo of white supremacy. So this is a part of a worldview and ideology that's been marinating in academia in the US and also Britain for decades, and now it has the ability to manifest in the real world through political organizations and politicians. The daughter of Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, who is a representative from Minneapolis, her daughter retweeted out a list of what quote-unquote comrades, what supplies they need in their riding. They need sticks, wood, plywood, and she's celebrated for that.
It's a sort of fashionable pose, isn't it? I mean, I'm not saying it's less dangerous for that, but it's a way of sort of sounding edgy and cool on social media, isn't it?
Yeah, because you don't face any social political costs if you are supporting left-wing extremism, in my opinion. I mean, you can look at academics who have expressed support for killing certain people and they face no censure, right? We have this imbalance of left-wing extremism being celebrated, supported, tolerated.
It's quite a bleak outlook, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm not quite optimistic. I think currently I'm working on my first book. It's about Antifa. And, just watching these events play out through this election year, it's, seeing the footage last night of Minneapolis being set on fire, I had a certain amount of shame for being a U.S. citizen, seeing so many fellow citizens take glee in destroying the livelihoods of others and being celebrated online for it. We have America has a sickness and it's ill. Doesn't seem like it's been healing at all.
Well, on that sad but worryingly true note, I think we'll end it. But Andy, thank you very much. I hope we can speak again on a happier day.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that episode of Americano. And I'd like to encourage you all to give us your feedback, positive comments or constructive comments only, please, to podcast@spectator.co.uk and say anything you like there as long as it's reasonably polite.